Bullshit.
Pretend for a moment we've entered a parallel universe, free of bullshit and full of bold solutions. That's what the No BS Show's all about. I'm your host, Dave Mastovich, and our guest today is Nick Jacobs, President and CEO at Clinical and Translational Genome Research Institute. More about him in a minute, but first, let's cut the bullshit. I was at a golf outing for Indiana University of Pennsylvania's Eberly College of Business this week. When I talked to some of the many successful alumni in attendance, I heard one of them say, "I'm not sure why, but some of our alumni kind of hold back from talking about where they went to school." This mindset seems to go beyond one university, one high school, one neighborhood, one town in the region. For some reason, people in Western Pennsylvania often apologize when they could be telling the positive stories about the region. "I'm from Katanning." "I'm from Greensburg," or even when you're on vacation, "I'm from Pittsburgh." People kind of mumble. Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania have so many positives. I wish we could help grow the confidence of our region. Instead of apologizing or mumbling where you're from or what you do, say it loud, say it proud. Go to visitpittsburgh.com if you need more details, such as Pittsburgh ranks among the top places to live, work, and visit in the United States. Our city is consistently recognized with accolades from major travel and financial organizations as one of the most livable cities with one of the most viable economies. We've been honored as a first-rate city for livability, culture, and economy for years. Examples: Travel and Leisure voted Pittsburgh among the best places to travel in 2016. Worth magazine selected Pittsburgh as one of their 15 dynamic cities in 2016. U.S. News ranks the Pittsburgh region as one of the most affordable places to live. The list could and does go on, again, at the Visit Pittsburgh website. My point is, be positive about your region. Tell the real story and go beyond the cliches. Be confident in the fact that you live in a great region. The No BS Show is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/NoBS. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Now, I mentioned IUP, and I don't stack the deck even though I'm loyal to IUP, but Nick is also an IUP grad. Nick Jacobs, he's International Director of Sunstone Management Resources. He's President and CEO at Clinical and Translational Genome Research Institute. He also serves on the board of the Integrative Health Policy Consortium. Nick was President and CEO of several organizations, including Winber Medical Center, Laurel Highlands Tourism, and Laurel Arts. He served in senior leadership roles for Mercy Medical Center and the Conemaugh Health System, now Duke LifePoint. And Nick's also author of the book, Taking the Hell Out of Healthcare. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Nick, you're an IUP grad, as am I. Let's start by having you walk us through your educational background and your career journey, telling us some anecdotes.
Well, let me start with my childhood and work my way to IUP.
Okay, that's fair.
So I came from I was a product of a mixed marriage. My mother was English, Scots, Irish, and my father was first generation Italian. And so I lived in a town where everybody was English, Scots, Irish. And it was an interesting journey for me because I had one foot in each camp, and I watched my father try to get jobs with the last name of Jacoboni, and the only job he could get would be a gandy dancer putting the spikes in the rails on the railroad. He changed his name to Jacobs, and he was immediately recruited to be a fireman and then an engineer on the railroad.
Messaging.
And it was very fascinating to me to see that transition. And once I became Jacobs, nobody knew what I was. And it was a fun and interesting journey. So as a kid, I started out in my various roles. I was a trumpet player and a paper boy and worked on the railroad, and I'll go back to that in a minute. And then I knew I wanted to be a musician, but I was concerned that I also knew that musicians weren't always readily employable. And so I had studied with a teacher at Carnegie Mellon all through high school on trumpet. And he offered me a partial scholarship to Carnegie Mellon, and I couldn't afford to go there even with a partial scholarship. And so I looked at all the other schools, and at that time, IUP was one of the only schools in the state that was unionized. And as it turned out, they were paying higher salaries than almost all of the private schools were. And so I selected the Indiana University of Pennsylvania Music Department because they had professors there from Berkeley and Eastman and Juilliard and all the great schools because they were paying so well, which was an interesting kind of unknown fact at the time. And I went to IUP, got a bachelor's degree, became a teacher, and went on and got a master's degree in performance with the trumpet, and played for the Ice Capades and the Ice Follies and Disney and all the different groups. I'm not going to name them all, and taught. And that was the real eye-opener for me, because that's where I learned my formulas for communication and for moving forward. I called it edutainment because I read a book called I'm Okay, You're Okay. If you've ever heard of that book.
Yes.
And I'm trying to think of who the author of that book was. But anyway, I read that book. Thomas Anthony Harris, that's who wrote that book. And it was a fascinating book to me because all the teachers that I worked with were parent to child. They were all talking to the kids like, sit down, open your book, shut up, uncross your legs, get your pencils out. And in that book, in those days, we talked about tapes instead of CDs or digital. And they said in that book that we had these 3 tapes playing in our head. One was our child tape, which is where all the fun was and the craziness and the stupid things and the great things that we enjoyed. And then we had our parent tape, which was, sit up, put your overshoes on, eat your broccoli. And then in the middle was this kind of adult mixture tape where everything you'd learned from your parents and your child and your influencers came together and you could make decisions. And so as a junior high school band director, I decided I was going to approach life using that tape. And I explained this to the kids. I said, look, you can act like kids, but I don't want to be your dad here. And let's work together. And we began having phenomenal outcomes. We had junior high school bands with 185 kids who were playing college level material. They were selecting the music and playing that level of material. And it was just a fascinating experience. I taught for 10 years. And at the end of 10 years, I knew I didn't want to be a principal or a superintendent, but I wanted to go forward with my life. And I took a job in sales and moved to Pittsburgh. And it was a catastrophe. There were 34 people in the same area that I was in sales, and 33 of them were of dubious background, and they were sharks. And I got into the area here, and I was dealing with 14 school districts, and that year 11 of them went on strike, and the gas crisis hit, and it was a catastrophe for me. And so I had to regroup and reinvent myself. And at that point, I decided, well, I was pretty good at the music thing. Maybe I could do something in the arts. And I ended up landing a job running an arts center in Somerset County. And that was the beginning of what I call permanent whitewater, because I didn't know this. I was not a business person at the time. I didn't know how to read financial sheets or whether they were doing accrual accounting or what they were doing. And here the place was completely bankrupt. And in fact, the first month I was there, they had their very first audit, and the auditors came in and they said, we have good news and bad news. And I said, okay, so what's the good news? And they said, you have $2,500 left in the bank. And I said, what's the bad news? And they said, this audit cost $2,600. So we were completely bankrupt. I had a wife and 2 kids, a house I couldn't sell in Pittsburgh with a mortgage at 19% in those days. And it was like, I have to make this work. I've never failed. I was a success at teaching, and I want to be a success at this. And so I dug deep, and I decided that I was pretty good at dealing with schools. And so I went to the school districts and said, look, guys, let me present your assemblies for you. And they gave me one shot. And I brought in a guy that did a one-man version of Mark Twain. And within 6 months, we were doing all of the assemblies for all of the school districts in all of Somerset County. And we became the largest presenter in Pennsylvania behind Penn State University. And the place exploded. It just took off. We ended up being the largest rural arts center east of the Mississippi. And I was doing this at that time virtually with no budget. So it was a lot of really creative in those days, posters and free newspapers and newspaper stories and any way I could get the word out. And one night I was walking through the parking lot of one of the concerts that I was presenting for the town, and I noticed that the cars weren't from Somerset. They were from Uniontown and from Cumberland and from Pittsburgh and from Altoona and from Johnstown. And I realized that what I was doing was tourism. I was doing arts tourism. And bottom line was that was my next journey. I ended up running the Laurel Highlands Convention and Visitors Bureau in Ligonier, and once again walked in the door after getting the job, and they were supposed to have been representing 3 counties, and from the time I accepted the job until I got the job, 2 of the counties had dropped out. And so I walked into a 1-county organization that had a very bad budget, and there was no room tax or anything at that time. And I dug in, and I said, I have to make this work. And I ended up convincing 2 of the counties to come back in. I picked up Greene County. I picked up part of Cambria County. And we became the 5th largest tourism bureau in the state of Pennsylvania. And it all happened, again, through tenacity and just refusing to fail. But it came from that winning formula that I got back in the teaching days.
The No BS Marketing Podcast with Dave Mastovich is brought to you by Mass Solutions. Put our 3-step No BS process to work for you. Visit masssolutions.biz today to take your marketing to another level. It's all about bold solutions, no BS.
And then I got a phone call from Senator John Hines from his people.
Well, let me interrupt you a second, though,
Yeah.
before you go into John Hines. So you learned a lot from that teaching. Where did you teach? Well, first of all, where'd you grow up?
I grew up, it's interesting, my mother's family founded Uniontown, Pennsylvania. They were Quakers, and they came here with William Penn. And in July 4th, 1776, the 2 brothers put their properties together and formed Uniontown. It was the union of their 2 properties called Beeson Town. But they didn't want it named after themselves because they were Quakers, and they thought that was too egomaniacal. And so they called it Uniontown.
So you grew up in Uniontown?
I grew up in Connellsville, Uniontown area.
Went to IUP, and then where did you teach when you had the
Johnstown.
teaching?
Well, I taught first at Plumboro for a year, and that was a tough experience. And then I came to Johnstown.
Greater Johnstown.
Yeah, I was at Garfield Junior High School at the time.
Okay. And then
to Westmont. I went to Westmont after that.
You went to Westmont. And after 10 years of teaching, you make that bold move.
Yeah, to sales.
You take that job. Well,
let me tell you about that.
Why were you living in Pittsburgh, though?
The only opening in that job was in Pittsburgh. And it was interesting because I don't say I failed at the job. Maybe the job failed me because of the circumstances with all the strikes and everything. But the training for that job was phenomenal. We had the time management expert from IBM. We had the positive mental attitude psychologist for the U.S. Olympics. I mean, we had some great training in that job. And I look back at that and think, I failed at the job maybe, but boy, did I learn from it. And it was a great learning experience on how to stay positive and stay focused and move forward.
So then you take the Somerset gig and
did it for 5 years.
You basically crafted it into something new with the whole new market.
Yeah.
With the assembly. So you had like a big idea, you drew down the target market, who you were going to call, and then you had to do messaging and do sales. So that was some serious marketing when you did all the assemblies, and you got the school districts to really see you as an important part of their product.
Their curriculum, right. And that was part of it. I mean, I also ran a big festival that we promoted everywhere, and it went from 1,500 people the first year to 15,000 the last year that I ran it. And we had classes. When I first got there, they were offering dog grooming and watercolor. And within a year, we had 123 classes running in 12 different places in the county. And it was a big income producer. And then we also had gallery shows. And I mean, I just pulled out all the stops and tried everything I could possibly try, but it ended up working.
Then you take the Laurel Highlands Convention and Visitors Bureau to be the 5th largest tourist
state at that time.
In the state.
Yeah.
Then you get a call from Senator John Hines.
Well, from his people. And I was to interview to become his, I forget exactly the title, but it was like administrative assistant or something like that. And I was on my way to Washington, D.C., and I had one of those car phones that were the size of, a small table. And the phone rang, and it was this headhunter from Salem, Massachusetts. And he said, I was hired to get you to become a head of marketing for a hospital in Johnstown. And I said, that's an easy phone call. I'm on my way to meet Senator Hines. I don't want to work in a hospital, and I'm not interested. And he said, well, where are you staying? And I said, I'm staying at the Hilton. And he said, meet me for breakfast before your meeting with Senator Hines. And it was like, I'll meet you, but I don't have any interest in working in a hospital. And he came and he said to me, look, he said, I get paid whether you take this job or not. So he said, why don't we make the list of the most outrageous demands you can think of? And we sat there over breakfast. It was outside. It was summertime. And we made this hilarious list of demands. It was like I wanted a private office with my own bathroom. I wanted to make $30,000 more. I wanted to get to go to Carnegie Mellon for my second master's degree. I wanted to go to Harvard for a certification. I wanted to become the CEO at some point. I just made this ridiculous list of commands. I wanted special kinds of computers, and I wanted to be able to bring my own staff in. And we both laughed, and I went to the interview with Hines, and I got back. And I got a phone call that they accepted all my demands. And it was like, oh, man.
And who was the person hiring you? Not the headhunter. Who was the person hiring you at?
Ted Baranek at the time, who was the CEO of the hospital.
CEO of Winburn.
No, this is at Mercy Hospital.
Mercy, okay.
And so I took the job, and I got there, and it was everything I was afraid it would be. I remember getting in the elevator the first day, and it opened up, and it was full of people in scrubs, and they were talking about T and A. And I thought, that's a pretty hip crowd. They saw the musical chorus line, and it turns out they were talking about tonsils and adenoids. And so it kind of changed. I realized I was a right-brainer kind of trapped in a left-brain world. And I had a series of CEOs, and every time I went to them and said, look, I don't know why you do it this way, but we need to change it, and I couldn't get any headway. They were all former football players, and they just didn't want to hear what I was talking about because it was like kind of the soft side of, women were the healthcare decision makers, but they were just doing their thing. And a lot of them were finance people, and it didn't resonate with any of them.
They weren't understanding to put the customer first.
That wasn't part of their culture. That wasn't part of their DNA.
And nor did they even understand who the customers were.
Exactly.
Because there were so many beyond just the ultimate patient. There's family, there's friends, there's referral sources,
right.
There's the outpatient places, there's the health insurers.
And it was a pretty simple world because it was like they looked at the doctor who brought the most money in, and that's the doctor who's
They made him king.
Became king, and that's what they did. And there were a lot of bullies. It was just a bad environment. I really didn't like it, and I could literally at one point touch the ulcers that I had in my stomach. I could feel them from the outside of my body. It was just, I was really unhappy, and in fact developed heart disease during that time, and it was really a very challenging time for me. And then I had the sisters decided to sell the place, and I remember. And these were the good old days because they don't even tell you anymore. But I remember getting 252 rejection letters. You don't even hear it now. They just don't even answer you back, But I had a folder with 252 rejection letters because I'd only been in healthcare for a few years, and I was a vice president, and I hadn't taken the traditional path. And so again, from a marketing perspective, one day I made a kind of a desperate call to a guy who I'd met who was a political liaison for the Hospital Association of Pennsylvania. And I said, I need a job. And he said, well, who are your references? And I told him my references. And he said, how about anybody in politics? And I said, well, I don't know, maybe a lieutenant governor. Mark Single was there at the time.
A Johnstown native.
Yeah, and so I didn't know Mark very well. I met him a few times. So it was about an hour later, he called me and said, I have never, ever gotten a reference like this from anybody for somebody. He said, I ran into Mark, and he just went on and on about you. And he said, I was a headhunter before I got this job, and I'm going to hook you up with a company out of Atlanta, Heidrick and Struggles. That they had hired.
I remember them.
They had hired Mitt Romney that year to do the Olympics, and they had hired Janet Reno to be the Attorney General. And so I flew down there, and they sent me out to Boys Town, and I was basically offered a CEO position at Boys Town National Research Hospital. And my wife wouldn't move there. She was a television celebrity at the time and wasn't going to move. And so it was a really interesting experience because I met this priest who swore like a sailor. He was a great guy. And I said, why do you call it a national research hospital? He said, well, I got this idea, and I hired 3 PhDs, and now we're a genome center in 1992. It's like, what's a genome? I thought it was like the little thing you put in your garden. I didn't know what he was talking about. And he explained they were going to crack childhood deafness and blindness through genetics. And that stuck in my brain. Like, that was really a phenomenon. He had hired 38 PhDs. They had $1 billion endowment, so that helped. But I came back, ended up getting hired as the chief communication officer at the Conemaugh Health System, and created a foundation for them. I'd created a foundation for Mercy, and I'd created a foundation for Laurel Highlands too. So that became kind of my sideline of creating foundations, fundraising foundations. Yeah.
That's Nick Jacobs, President and CEO at Clinical and Translational Genome Research Institute. And I'm your host, Dave Mastovich. It's the No BS Marketing Show. Nick, you've walked us through your career path. It's really interesting. You still have a couple more places to go.
Just one.
And so let's dive right into the last part of your career journey.
Yeah, so one day I'm walking down the hall and the CEO says to me, I want you to apply to be the president of Windber Medical Center. And I said, if I wanted that kind of embarrassment, I could stand naked in front of a mirror. I don't really want to go run a little hospital that's in trouble. And he said, no, you need to apply. Well, I didn't realize this, but he had told everybody that. And as it turned out, they did a national search, and there were 138 people that had applied for the job. And so I thought, well, I'm going to approach this from a marketing perspective. Everybody else they were looking at were operations people. And I had a whole staff of people, and we did a complete deep dive marketing analysis of what it would take to turn the place around. And I presented a full-color strategic marketing plan for how to turn the hospital around. And I even included pictures of my vision of what the new hospital buildings would look like. And I got the job by one vote. And I was in the position for a month, and Ernst & Young came in and said, you're going out of business. It's over. You can't make it. Capitated managed care is going to take you out. And it gave me power that I never, ever, ever dreamed of, because I went to the board and I said, look, guys and lady, we're going out of business. So we can go to 84 Lumber and buy plywood and pick which windows we want to cover, or you can let me do all these things that I've wanted to do for the last many years. Not with them, but my previous positions. And they said, well, go ahead. And that was the beginning of the story. Mm-hmm. And it went from there.
And Nick, I want to touch on some of those stories, because there were a couple of really creative things I can recall that you brought to the marketplace that were really customer focused and positive. But we also want to make sure we talk to you about the things that we go through on the No BS show, such as mentors. Who were mentors other than your parents, and how have they impacted you? Yeah,
I had two. I had my second superintendent ended up becoming the mayor of the city up in Johnstown, a guy named Don Zucco. And Don was, I remember going into his office the very first day I was hired, and I said, what do you expect from me to do? I was like 22 years old. And he said, it's up to you. He said, you have the job. It's up to you. And he said, I'll support you, and I'll kick down the doors if anybody gets in your way. And at the end of the year, he called me back in. He said, I just want to tell you that when you asked me that question and I didn't give you a straight answer, he said, you've ended up doing 10 times more than I would have ever thought to ask you to do. And it showed me that, trusting people, believing in people, supporting people, that was really and we became really close friends. And he ended up being a reference on every job I ever got after that. And
I've worked with Don over the years a lot of times as a true leader, and he still does so much for that region, Johnstown region.
And then when I was going for the Arts Center job, it was interesting because I had gone into an old bank that's no longer there and taken my resume into the marketing department, and the head of marketing picked up my resume in front of me and did this and threw it in a wastebasket. And so I was pretty despondent. I went out and got in the elevator, and I was going down in the elevator, and one of my former students' mothers was in the elevator, and she worked there, and I told her what happened, and she said, come with me. My boss is looking for someone to run the education department here. And so they took me to lunch, and I went to this place. It was all men, and I didn't know what it was. And I sat down with this guy. I thought he worked for the bank or something. And here it was a place called the Bachelor's Club in those days. It was like an elite place for the old, the head people that ran the city. And this guy proceeds to tell me that his father had been recruited here because he was a great French horn player, and he was recruited by the steel industry to come in and play in a brass band to entertain the employees. And then he went on to be this gentleman went on to become a drummer, and he got a full scholarship to Valley Forge Military Academy, graduated from there, and ended up becoming a full colonel by the time he was 26 years old. And he became my mentor. And he was the guy that said, stop wearing the polyester, get yourself some real silk ties. And, he really brought me into the business world. But he was a cut and dry, tough old bird. And they used to joke about the fact that he had his first communion money in his shoe. He's passed away now, but his name was John Gunter. And I still teach the Gunter Leadership Program for the leaders for the Chamber of Commerce there.
All kinds of good stuff from Nick Jacobs, talking about messaging, the importance of messaging, talking about trust. And I always use the phrase that one of my mentors taught me, George Hartnett, trust begets trust. And then talking about how you were brought into situations, given an opportunity, and you turned it into a real positive. It's like Don Zuko saying you did 10 times more than what he thought you would actually produce. But now let's put you on the spot. Talk about a learning experience when maybe you were a BS employee, a tough boss, or maybe your communication wasn't what it needed to be. Looking back, when do you think you might have been guilty of some BS?
Yeah, I have to say that as a teacher, I used exaggeration as for fun. I was like a comedian. I said funny things, and I would exaggerate, and I would exaggerate wildly. I'd say, with 10,000, blah, 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 blah. And the kids would laugh, and I would laugh. And I began using that in all of my humor. And all of a sudden, I was in a position of leadership, and I still had that little twinge of tending to exaggerate. And I remember when I was running the Arts Center once, I put a big story in one of the Pittsburgh papers saying we were going to have the world's largest garage sale. Well, it was just a little nothing garage sale, but I got called in for it. It was like, this was not the world's largest garage sale. This was like a crummy little garage sale. And it was like, oh, I better stop exaggerating so much because people take me seriously now. I'm not just being a comedian. And then later on, when I got into, hospital communication, I found that, again, there were a lot of people who were really great in math and science and really great at accounting and things like that. And they tended to be black and white, literal people. And those of us in marketing tended to look for the best and really promote the best. And the black and white literal people often looked at that as lying, exaggeration. You're talking too much about how great that particular thing is. But I was always caught in the middle of that because people want to be with a winner and people understand winning. And so I can remember physicians who were probably mediocre from when they arrived, but I pretty much was able to promote them into being gods, of really building their reputations beyond sometimes what they deserved. And so I'd have to say that if you were going to hit the BS meter, it would have been when I was doing that. I was over-exaggerating some of their background or their skills.
It's a good story because I agree with you. But the black and white literal thinkers thinking that marketers are exaggerative, or a lot of times the CFO types will call us a cost center rather than saying how we can generate revenue. Excellent vulnerability there. Hear more of my interview with Nick Jacobs on part 2